Coming up,
they're destroying us slowly. They're taking our resources, everything.
tens of thousands of people descend on the Houses of Parliament in London, demanding politicians pay attention to the science behind the climate crisis. We join the protests and Extinction Rebellion, one of environmental activism's heavyweights.
Do you get the impression that your image is changing and people are listening again?
Well, I would probably refute the idea that we weren't ever listened to in the first place.
A new study reveals an increase in global wind and solar energy production, with predictions of a fast declining fossil fuel industry. And the Black Mambas has a reputation as a formidable anti-poaching group in South Africa. One member opens up about the dangers the all-female unit faces while protecting endangered species.
Elephants are still being poached for their tusks. Pangolins are still being taken for their meat. Is what you're doing enough?
We haven't lost a rhino in a long time.
This is Just 2 Degrees, TRT World. We gotta start with the gathering outside the British Parliament that was organised by Extinction Rebellion, one of the planet's most vocal environmental groups. They took part in 4 days of activism called the Big One. Tens of thousands of people were there, with the goal of increasing pressure on the UK's politicians to tackle rising global temperatures. Oh, and these marches took place just before Earth Day, which itself followed weeks of extreme heat in places like Thailand and India.
Well, their current strategy is not listening to the science. I'm an air quality scientist, and we can see here we're in one of the busiest streets of London. The air pollution created from this and the agriculture ammonia is creating a spring haze over London. Now, all of this comes from meat and dairy and fossil fuels. Now, what the government are not doing is taking either of those two things into account, trying to reduce either of those two things. Instead, they're trying to get over 100 new oil and gas licenses, which are incompatible with a 1.5 degree warming world.
I grew up in Delhi, in India, and I remember, summer holidays being quite okay to be outside and playing with my friends in the afternoons, and it is impossible. It feels like when I go to Delhi now, but my parents still live there, it feels like putting your head in the oven. It's 48 degrees, sometimes 50 degrees. And I think this is not just my experience alone. Pakistan was near destroyed in floods last year. And like I said, London broke all records. As I ran through the parks in London, it felt like some sort of a dystopian film. And we can't afford that anymore. And the less disenfranchised you are, if you're a person who doesn't make enough money, cost of living crisis, we are all facing that. It is affecting us more and more. So climate impacts are here.
My people's well-being is very important. And especially the Shell, the petrol, the BP, everything. They need to stop the harm they're doing to Africa. They're destroying us slowly. They're destroying us. They're taking our resources, everything, and empowering our leaders, which is so unfair. I would never want a wrong leader to lead England. I love England, I love the people, because we're women being first. So they should do the same thing and stop empowering our useless leaders in Africa.
And just as the protests were getting underway, we caught up with our friend Yaz of Extinction Rebellion.
What's happening? What's going on?
Okay, so about 40,000 people have come to the Houses of Parliament in Westminster in central London. We are coming from 200 different organisations, including Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, PCS Union, Avaz, tons of groups. Currently at the main stage behind me, there are hundreds of people sitting down and engaging. People's Assembly, that's a form of deliberative democracy, a way of solving problems, and it's similar to our main demand, the main reason we're here, which is to update politics, to give ordinary people a say in the direction that this country takes by using things called citizens' assemblies.
Do you get the impression that the British government is listening?
At the moment, no. I think that what it takes for the British government to listen is for serious returns. So we're only here for the first day. We're given them a deadline at 5 p.m. on Monday to respond to our demands, and we may need to step it up in the long term beyond that. But bigger than just getting the government to negotiate with us, what we've done here is brought so many people from so many different backgrounds and corners and issue advocacy, and they're all here to kind of unite to survive. And that's what it's really about. It's about the people that have come, that are on their own journey, that are stepping up and realizing that we're not all alone in it.
You know, Yaz, when you and I previously spoke, we talked about the idea that groups like Extinction Rebellion were kind of garnering a bad rep based on the shocking types of displays that you would choose to do. Have you guys scaled it down now? Do you get the impression that your image is changing and people are listening again?
Well, I would probably refute the idea that we weren't ever listened to in the first place. I think one thing that's really interesting is that the public are totally on board with that. The press, on the other hand, have certainly got very, you know, people coming into the structure, and they've made that the story. But I suppose what I've learned from this experience is that despite what the press narrative is, the people on the ground really understand why we're here. And I think there's a great cause for hope in terms of connecting it to the ordinary people in the public.
Well, on a previous episode, we featured the Black Mambas, not the snakes. It's a group of women from South Africa who've made it their duty to protect endangered animals like rhinos and elephants from poaching. Well, we've tried for a long time to get them on Just 2 Degrees, and it finally happened.
The Black Mambas group hopes to achieve more eyes and ears from the people all over South Africa to protect the iconic animals, because by putting our boots in the ground alone, we might not win the war. So we need more support, more people looking out for us and for animals. And we want to achieve saving more rhinos or more wild animals and pushing out the poachers out of the reserve. We also have a Bush Baby project where we share our knowledge and ideas with the kids at school and the bush grannies. So by doing that, we want to, we're investing in them, and that's how we send message to so many people in the village. We want everyone to get the message that the Black Mambas are speaking. And one thing that we also want to achieve is to have more groups of ladies all over South Africa in protecting the iconic animals, because we have a lot of male people and we grew up in a world where we're told that women cannot enter into the men's world. So we want to achieve this by having more groups, more ladies, more anti-poaching units all over Africa.
Leitah, you mentioned poachers. When I think of one, I think of a heavily armed man, so heavily armed he can take down an elephant. How do the Black Mambas go up against or protect wildlife against an armed poacher, considering that you yourselves are not armed?
So it's quite an interesting question. It has worked and it is working for the Black Mambas. For the past 10 years, we've been putting our boots in the ground without a weapon. We are not fighting with anyone. We are not in a war of putting blood down, but we are in a war of saving the animals. We know that we are between the animals and the poachers that are fully armed. And we are talking about professional people who know how to use a weapon, like retired soldiers, retired police who know what they're doing when they're holding a weapon, and we don't have the knowledge. But what the Black Mambas are doing is advertise themselves in the Baluli boundaries, in the fence line. We are unarmed. We're not fighting with anyone. We are protecting the iconic animals. Once we see a poacher, we hide and give information to our 4 armed rangers. But then we continue giving them the movement of the poachers, because we don't want to win this using bullets, but we want to win it using knowledge and sharing our ideas and stories with the whole world.
I understand that you guys use education quite often as some sort of soft power to influence younger minds. Poaching, we know, is a very complicated issue. Very powerful organizations use poor men in particular in Southern Africa to do their dirty work for them. So how difficult is it for you to teach younger minds against poaching, considering some people just need that money?
It is not difficult for us to teach the young minds, because we go to them, we are their mothers. We are telling them exactly what is happening. We're telling them real things, and we take them to come in the reserve and to see what we are doing. So they know what we are talking about, and they know that there are poachers out there. We have a bush baby program. They come into the bush for a holiday of 3 days, and then we take them to see where we are patrolling. We take them to go for game drive. So young minds are very good in understanding easily, because we are talking about their careers here. When they grow up, they want to be rangers, trekkers, and all of them. It's not easy to tell an old person to protect animals while they've never been to the game reserve, or they have never had a relationship with an animal. But with young minds, using education and bringing them to the game reserve, it's very much easy. They have so many questions. They want to understand why people are poaching. They want to understand the importance of having the animals around. And if you give them those answers and you show them the guests when they're on game drive, they've paid a lot of money to come and see that rhino that we're just seeing every day on our patrol. So it is quite easy for them to understand, because we are now living a modern life. It's not like long time ago when we grew up, when we couldn't go inside the reserve because of lack of money, lack of infrastructure, and our parents not knowing anyone the game reserve. But now, as I said, that we are living in a modern life. We take our kids to the game reserves. They know what is happening. They know the wild animals. They know poaching. So it makes it easy for us when we teach them, because we are teaching kids from the village where we are coming from.
But later, elephants are still being poached for their tusks. Pangolins are still being taken for their meat. Is what you're doing enough?
I think what the Black Mambas are doing is way more enough, because ever since we started in 2013, we have decreased rhino poaching with 62% and bushmeat poaching. And in the reserve that the Black Mambas are working, we haven't lost a rhino in a long time. And Black Mambas are very much active. If we hear about an information that there's someone want to come and kill a rhino, we get active immediately. We patrol the boundaries. We know where our hotspots are. We pet the pangolins, and we have 4 ladies who follow up on the pangolin that we are having inside our reserve. So yeah, we are trying our best, and we're going to continue doing the best for the iconic animals for our next generation.
What an impressive group, right? Well, it seems we're heading in the right direction when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. A report by climate and energy think tank Ember says wind and solar energy hit a record high of 12% in global power generation last year, a figure that's expected to rise in 2023 and beyond. But there is bad news. There always is, isn't there? Dominic breaks it down.
The largest source of carbon emissions globally, oil and gas accounts 40% of greenhouse gases. It's an industry the world is struggling to replace. But Ember, an energy think tank, has some good news for the planet. An Ember study says wind and solar power is growing by at least 15% every year for the last decade. But while things are looking up for clean energy, it's done very little to stop the use of fossil fuels. There are many examples from around the world of how some of the richest countries are continuing to use fossil fuels, but are also invested in green energy supplies. China is the world's biggest user of coal. At the same time, around 50% of new wind power and 40% of new solar comes from Beijing. The United States, another top polluter, produces 20% of the world's dirty energy. But the Biden administration says it's committed to changing the status quo and is pushing companies to invest in electric vehicles and other cleaner technologies.
So far, there's no such thing as clean coal. And we're not building new coal plants, and most countries in the world are not. In fact, coal is being phased out even now by the marketplace, not because somebody said, oh, you know, they're being shut down. The marketplace is not supporting that.
The EU is emerging as a leader in decarbonization. The European Parliament approved a law in February that will ban the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2035. The law also sets a 55% cut in carbon emissions for new cars sold from 2030.
We can say Europe leads the green revolution, and we will be the world's first climate neutral continent. And the deals on the reform of the emissions trading system, the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the social climate fund are all central and complementary in keeping the European Green Deal on track. These laws will put a price on the carbon we produce, and it means that the most polluting industries will have to increase their emission reduction targets. It will also put a price for non-EU producers, providing a level playing field so that we will not leave our industry at a disadvantage vis-à-vis their external competitors. They will also need to pay for their emissions if their products are to be sold in Europe. And with the help of the Social Climate Fund, amounting to an estimated total of 86.7 billion euros, this will ensure that the climate transition leaves no one behind. We have to make this transition together.
Making the transition from fossil fuel to green energy is easier said than done. The world is far from meeting its international climate targets to keep global warming well below 2 degrees. Finance for developing countries to mitigate the climate crisis is also needed. According to the United Nations, most countries, including the top polluters such as China, the US and India, are still lagging behind to cut their carbon emissions. Sweden, on the other hand, has faced criticism for a backward climate policy which could see greenhouse gas emissions rise in the country. Energy experts say net zero targets remain uncertain and critical action needs to be taken now. Dominic Brian Omondi, Just 2 Degrees.
Well, to discuss the study, Dave Jones is the head of Global Insights at Ember. Hi, Dave. It's good seeing you.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Not a problem. As I understand it, your company analyzed data from 78 countries representing 93% of global demand for electricity. Just break down for us, where exactly was this boom in wind and solar energy exactly?
And when you look across the world, there are some real patterns in where that's happening. Broadly speaking, it's happening almost everywhere. So I think to start with, like a decade ago, you've got that kind of slow build up in a few countries, but now it's really coming mainstream in so many countries. So globally, 12% of the world's electricity is now from wind and solar generation last year. For Europe, for the US, it's slightly higher. For Asia as a whole, it's around about that global average. China is a little bit above that level, in line with the United States, around 14% of its electricity coming from wind and solar. India is slightly below that, about 9% of its electricity from wind and solar. And really, there's only a couple of regions globally that are lagging behind on that, which is within Africa, which is struggling to attract investment, and within the Middle East, where still almost all the electricity comes from fossil fuels.
And there seems to be an interesting contrast here. Most of these countries that have increased their renewable energy output are also the biggest greenhouse gas emitters.
Yeah, so certainly within Europe and the US, still a huge amount of the electricity produced is from not only coal but from gas generation. In the US and Europe, there's huge strides to phase out coal power, and already coal power in both regions has more than halved in the last decade. There's still room to go on coal, but still so much of their electricity still comes from gas generation. So there's still great progress, but there's still a lot of work to do in those regions. Within your report just before, you spent a lot of time talking around China, and China, of course, is over half of the world's coal power generation. They placed to peak coal use in 2025. When you look at how much wind and solar and other forms of clean power that they're building at the moment, it's quite feasible that their coal power use, despite actually building new coal power stations, it's quite possible that their coal power use peaks even before 2025, because of that amount of clean power is coming online is probably going to be rising more than electricity demand in itself will be rising in the next year or two.
Interesting. Well, according to Ember's report, 2023, this year, is the first year to see a decline in the use of fossil fuels to generate electricity outside of global crises like pandemics and recessions. Do you think this is really the beginning of the end of the fossil age?
So it's got to start with electricity because that's where the most effort is happening. That's where those twin super energy powers that are wind and solar are coming through in other sectors. That transition, like in heat and transport, that transition is coming, but it's quite a few years behind at the moment. So it's going to be down to the power sector emissions to start the decline in emissions. They hit an all-time high in 2022, but like you say, we believe 2023 will be the first year outside of a recession that power sector emissions will fall, leaving 2022 as the highest power sector and possibly the highest power sector emissions that will ever happen looking forward, and leaving us a new era of clean power, of a new era of clean power and falling power sector emissions. And what we can see now is within the other sectors as well. There's more electric vehicles, there's more heat pumps coming online. That clean power that's being built isn't just decarbonising the power sector. That clean power being built is also going to quickly contribute towards falling emissions across all the sectors of the economy.
Just 20 seconds left with you, Dave. Based on your report's findings and the positive trends you've highlighted, can we keep global temperatures from rising above 2 degrees Celsius?
The challenge for wind and solar is to keep those massive growth rates that are going that we've seen so far. So at the moment, we're probably building between a quarter. We need to build between 3 to 4 times what we're building at the moment. So Irina said we were building 300 gigawatts last year of renewable generation. It needs to be over a terawatt a year that we're building globally. And to do that, we need to keep seeing year-on-year growth. And if we keep that growth in the way that it has been going, we'll be on target. But that require with a growing industry, very easy to see high growth rates, like in a startup situation. But as industries mature, keeping those growth rates up is going to be a real challenge. Let's hope it. So,
Dave, appreciate chatting with you. Thank you so much for your time. Well, as we mentioned, the US is implementing some of its toughest carbon emissions restrictions to date. But experts say it'll be expensive and won't come easy. Here's Sarah.
A 13% cut in pollution, a 56% cut in emissions from all cars and vans, stricter standards for trucks, all within a decade, and all proposed by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. If approved, analysts say the requirements could be tough to meet, as they're even stricter than those already established for 2026.
These new EPA standards are so stringent that they're estimated that they're going to have to have 2/3 of all cars are going to have to be electric by 2032.
The proposals are scheduled to come into force between 2027 and 2032 and are the most aggressive of their kind ever made in the U.S. They're designed to prevent billions of tons of CO2 from entering the atmosphere over the next 3 decades. The Biden administration is reportedly moving fast to finalize the new policies, which include safeguards against future presidents pulling a Trump and rolling them back. But analysts say there will be challenges.
The single most important one is if people plug in their vehicles to the electrical grid, the pollution may just occur at the power plant instead of at the tailpipe of the car. So we need the electricity system to be much cleaner, making more use of either renewables like wind and solar or nuclear power. But if we continue to rely heavily on coal and natural gas, that 56% reduction in pollution will be offset by some pollution at the power plant.
Infrastructure is another problem.
That network is very slow in being developed, and for a lot of consumers, it will be inconvenient compared to what they're used to. They can refuel their gasoline vehicle in 2 to 4 minutes. It may take them 20 to 30 minutes to get an 80% charge, even on the most expensive of the public charging systems.
And estimated savings on fuel may not make up for the increase in production cost.
It's roughly $12,000 more expensive to build an electric car than to build a gasoline-powered car. Now, the hope is, over time, that the cost of lithium-ion batteries will come down substantially.
But while those costs have dropped over the years, demand for raw minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel is high, and resources are finite. And the price of electricity itself may go up to pay for new power plants and roads. And these aren't the only concerns. Workers in the auto and fossil fuel sectors need job security in a rapidly changing market. The United Auto Workers Union is wary of sweeping changes, saying forcing workers to decide between good jobs and green jobs is a false choice. Sarah Balter, Just 2 Degrees.
Well, that's how we wrap this episode of Just 2 Degrees. What are you doing for the climate? Think about it. We'll see you next time. Bye.